Hi, and welcome to Module 5 in Lecture 1. We just finished in the previous two modules discussing theory creation and theory building. Now we're going to talk about ways of testing and sort of evaluating our theories that are different from empirical tests of our hypotheses. Because this is important because empirical tests are not the only way to evaluate our theories. We also evaluate them based on logical grounds and the reasonableness of our assumptions. Okay, so let's begin with two really important ways of evaluating our theories. One is our theory causal, right? It is absolutely required for a theory to be useful that it be causal, that it explain how changes in the dependent variable y are caused by changes in the independent variable or variables x. Right? If our theory is not causal, we're not explaining causal connections in the world, we're not really providing a theory of how the world works. 2. Does our theory generate testable hypotheses? As I said before, for a theory to be testable, it must be falsifiable. So our theory must produce falsifiable hypotheses, ones we can go out and test with empirical data and see whether or not we have support for that theory or if our hypothesis is rejected. This is key, and these two both are key. If our theory lacks causality and does not produce any falsifiable hypotheses, we don't really have a theory we can go ahead with. That's important. And these are two important ways to evaluate our theory before we do any kind of measurement or any kind of hypothesis testing. We want to make absolutely sure that our theory is causal and produces testable, falsifiable hypotheses. Okay. Less important but often used are two other ways of evaluating our theory. The first is simplicity or parsimony, that our theory doesn't have too many extraneous moving parts. So we want in general to connect our x, our independent variable, with our dependent variable y in the shortest way possible, in the clearest, simplest way possible, using the shortest explanatory route. In general, the reasoning behind that is that parsimonious theories are easier to understand, to translate into sort of common language, right? So if you have a theory with 1,000 moving parts, it's very difficult to figure out which moving part was the one that led to the outcome. Whereas if you have only one or two moving parts, it's much clearer to assign meaning and cause for the actions of those one or two variables. Occam's razor is sort of a statement of this, that the sort of simplest theory that explains it is the correct one. I should say, while simplicity is valuable in helping us understand our theories and parse them and interpret them, it's not necessarily necessary, strictly speaking, in that there's no cosmic rule that says the simplest theory must be the correct one. It might be that the world is very complicated in certain ways, and a more complex theory is the more accurate one. This is just a rule of thumb to help us develop theories that don't include all the complexity of the real world, because any theory that was just mirroring the complexity of the real world would be as complex as the real world and take as long to analyze as the real world takes to move forward and would not be very useful for understanding the world itself. So it is helpful to have simpler theories to simplify from the full complexity of the real world. Just be aware that you can't always remove all extra nuance to get to the simplest thing you could possibly imagine, because sometimes that nuance is important, so keep that in mind. Similarly, we often want theories to be novel and interesting, by which we mean these theories make new predictions, and they don't produce predictions or explanations that are sort of obvious to everyone already. That's important, mostly because we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? We don't want to do the same things that have been done already over and over again. We want to create new theories, or at least new angles on theories that let us understand new things. In practice, that often means that theories yield counterintuitive results, so results that go counter to our intuition that are surprising to us. But it doesn't have to. It could also just mean that these theories clarify your understanding of some causal mechanism behind some phenomenon that we had not previously had a clear understanding of. So before we might have known that people vote in a certain way, but now with this new understanding you provide, this new causal mechanism, we understand it better. even though the outcome wasn't necessarily counterintuitive to us. That said, counterintuitive results, while very sort of valued in political science, particularly in political science and economics, you have to be careful because the drive to sort of get counterintuitive results can sometimes lead to results that don't hold up when their assumptions are really probed, really examined in depth, because sometimes counterintuitive results arise not because they're true, but because some assumption that wasn't necessarily true itself led to them. So it seems really exciting, like, oh, I never thought of that before, right? That's crazy. That's so counter to my intuition. Oh, but it all follows from this assumption, which is clearly false. So I get it. That's not that important. It doesn't really match the real world. So while counterintuitive results are helpful and interesting to sort of strive for because they're surprising and interesting and novel, you have to be careful that your results aren't due to just an odd assumption that you're making, because oftentimes intuition exists because it actually is accurate. It often does match the real world, which is sort of why it exists. So as long as in general your theory is providing something new, whether it be a new counter to our intuition or whether it be a better and clearer causal mechanism underlying some phenomenon, even if it's intuitive, that's all good. Right? Those are good improvements to our knowledge base, because that's really what science is again, right? It's the incremental building up of knowledge, and providing some new piece of that knowledge is always helpful. Okay. Having sort of talked about evaluation, now we're going to move to guidelines for building a theory before we sort of finish this part on theory building. So remember, we started off by discussing the first step is to present a research question, which could be derived from some pattern you observe in nature, or it could be some puzzle you have. So let's ask, what is a puzzle? A puzzle here is when you have an expectation that, say, two cases should be similar or two cases should be different, and then the outcome that you observe is different from what you would have expected. So in some ways, it's a counterintuitive type of result, right? It's a situation in which you expect something and it's surprising to you because it's different from what you expected. Beginning with a puzzle to your research question can have lots of benefits. It requires knowledge of events, so you can identify real-world puzzles, and that's good. Having this knowledge can be helpful for grounding your results, right? And it grounds your theory in concrete cases, right? Concrete cases in the real world of which you have knowledge, and that's all good. It also makes us look for non-obvious cases, right? You try to find situations in which you are surprised by something as opposed to just expecting it. So these are all good things in general. Plus, not mentioned here, but it's really good. Puzzles can be really good because they also draw in the reader. When you write a theory, you are not just talking to yourself, you're talking to the entire scientific community and hopefully people outside the scientific community. A puzzle can often draw them in, get them interested and involved in your research question, which helps scientific communication and also communication to the broader public. So that's great. However, you have to be careful. Puzzles can often help push us to focus on rare events too much, right? If you're looking for situations that are counter to intuition, you might identify the one case out of 1,000 that is surprising and doesn't act in the way you would expect. Then you develop a theory based on that one puzzling case and put forth a theory as if it's a general theory, when it turns out that theory only applied to cases like that rare case and not to the broad group of cases in the world. Because of that, puzzles can sometimes lead you astray in the same way the search for counterintuitive results can lead you astray, in that they sort of push you to look for things that are not common. So just be careful about that. It's not a big problem because you can always limit your scope conditions of your theory and say, okay, my theory applies to cases like in this puzzle. That said, oftentimes you're not trying to describe things like a single puzzle. You're trying to describe broader phenomenon. And if the puzzling case is just a very surprising singular case, you end up describing that case rather than providing broader theoretical contributions. So just be aware of that. But in general, puzzles can be a nice way to get people involved and to get yourself involved in a project and provide a nice hook to yourself and others to be interested in the project as well. Okay. Once we have sort of a research question set up, we move on to what social scientists often call micro-foundations. It's a little bit of a weird word. It basically means, rather than taking a broad-based theory that says things like the government works this way or this country works this way, we provide in-depth logic underlying how the actors involved in the government's actions actually behave. So we bring it down from the big aggregate level to the individualized level to provide micro-foundations for smaller, in a sense, actors, right? So rather than the country, we'll discuss the decision makers who are present in the country's decisions and figure out what they want and what they do and how they decide things. Rather than saying the country does this, you'll say, well, here are the relevant decision makers in the country, and they care about these things and so on. And that provides what we call a micro-foundation for the broader theory. More specifically, micro-foundations involve things like actors. Who are the actors in the model, right? If you're thinking about countries' policymaking, are we talking about the executive branch, right? The president, prime minister, and so on? Are we talking about legislative branches, right? Congress people? What are the goals of these actors? Right? What do they want? Are they just seeking re-election? Or do they have specific policy goals they want to achieve? Are they looking out for only the constituents or the entire country's interests? Right? These are all different goals individual politicians might have, and specifying their goals is important. Right? Or on a lower level, if you're looking at public opinion, right, the actors are us, individuals in the public, in the mass public, and we can ask what we want. Right? When we respond to policies and to outcomes, we're responding based on our preferences and on what we want. So identifying our own goals and our own preferences is important to help us develop theories about how we should change our opinions. Besides the actors and their goals, we also talk about institutions. Institutions can be anything from a formal institution like the Congress or the Constitution or some intergovernmental organization to more informal institutions like large-scale social norms that change our behavior. In general, institutions can have multiple effects. One is that they constrain actors' options. Right? The Constitution lays out rights and responsibilities, and that constrains what individuals can do. The law is an institution that also constrains our actions we can take without suffering consequences. Institutions affect actors' preferences as well. Institutions change how we view things, right? Growing up in one type of government versus another type of government changes how we view the worth of the government, of the pieces of the government. Growing up in different kinds of families change how we form our own preferences over outcomes. So institutions themselves can alter our preferences and alter what we want via socialization and other factors. Institutions also affect actors' incentives. So they affect the things we want. If we are living in a capitalist society, we want to earn money. We have to earn money to live. So that affects the decisions we make in terms of what kind of careers we get. So all these things alter our incentives. So institutions can alter our incentives, our preferences, and our options that we can take. And laying out actors and goals and institutions and constraints helps us provide what we call micro-foundations to our theory. So our theory is better grounded than just sort of airy notions of what the country wants. Rather, we specify who are the actual actors within the country and what they want. Or rather, instead of looking at just the public wants, because what is the public really? It's just us. We talk about what individuals within the public want and how they can act. So it's a micro-foundation for the broader theory. Okay. Once we've got a sense of who our actors are and what they want and what their constraints are, we have to start putting forth assumptions for our theory. Making these explicit is important. As we discussed before, we'll discuss again as well. You can write these out formally, as we discussed in the formal theory module last time, or just verbally in prose. It doesn't really matter as long as you're very clear and explicit about your assumptions. These assumptions are inherently simplifications, right? No matter, as we said before, we can't have an assumption of everything that happens in the real world because the model would be too complex to actually be useful. So we're trying to understand a subset of the causal interactions that happen in the real world, and we're taking simplified assumptions to help us understand that thing. These assumptions are often also generalizable. It's generalizations. They're generalizations not about an individual and what that person wants, but about all individuals of a particular group, of a particular population, what they all want. We're trying to identify central average tendencies, not specify the nuance that makes us all different in our own ways. Rather, we want to understand general tendencies among populations of interest. To get at generalizations, it's important to make our nouns and verbs general, right? Rather than discuss this president wants to be reelected, we move more generally to presidents want to be reelected. Or maybe if our theory is not just about presidents, but about politicians in general, we move even more generally from presidents want to be reelected to politicians want to be reelected. These are our assumptions we're making about our concepts, about our actors' preferences and goals, and they help us form our theory. More general is always better, but be careful in the sense that your theory is more widely applicable, has more external validity, but be careful to not overgeneralize, right? And theory and previous research can help us understand when we might be overgeneralizing. Overgeneralization means we take our theory and apply it past the scope of its applicability, right? Past the scope of the area to which it should apply. So, for instance, if we think politicians in general want re-election, then we should make that the most general statement we can. If, on the other hand, we think politicians in general might have different kinds of preferences and only presidents really focus on re-election, then we wouldn't want to generalize from presidents to politicians, because that would make our theory too general and the assumptions underlying the president's actions would no longer apply to other politicians. In general, the more specific your assumptions, the narrower the scope of your theory, right? If you interview an individual, a single person, very carefully and list all of that person's goals and preferences and interests and incentives and constraints, you will have a very accurate portrayal, potentially, of that one person's behavior and can model that person's behavior very accurately, but the scope conditions for that theory are very narrow. They apply only to that person because a different person might have different preferences. In contrast, broad ideas like, I want to be reelected, if I'm a politician, might apply very broadly. So the scope condition could be much wider. So in general, more general assumptions also allow for broader scope conditions. So if I say politicians only want to be reelected and that's all I care about, that's going to apply to many fewer politicians than the statement politicians want to be reelected among other things they care about, like potentially policy outcomes. That second statement is much broader and has a much wider scope because it includes many more individuals. So just be careful to sort of work out what the scope of your model, of your theory is, and generalize to the right amount, as much as you can, but not more than you can. And that's a difficult thing to do, and people still struggle with that, but it's worthwhile doing. Okay, once you have these sort of assumptions down, we start checking the logic of your argument, right? Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Is the form of the argument valid? Are the premises valid, right? Are your assumptions valid? Here what you're looking for is whether or not your conclusions are really robust to your assumptions, right? So what if I varied the assumptions slightly? What if I was slightly wrong about the assumptions? If my conclusions completely fall apart, my theory is pretty brittle, right? It's not very robust because a slight change in the assumptions can destroy the entire conclusion. And since I know my assumptions are simplifications and are probably not exactly true, if I vary them slightly and my conclusion falls apart, I don't have much confidence in my theory. In contrast, if I can vary my assumptions, a decent amount and my conclusions still hold, I might have more logical faith and confidence in my theory that it's robust to small errors and small mistakes I make in my assumptions that are probably present. Okay, so that's sort of the first step. Now we're going to sort of take our assumptions and use a series of assumptions to lead through to an implication. So here's an example of that. Right, so politicians want to retain office. They want to be reelected. That's an assumption. It has reasonable support. We're not saying that they only want that, but that the fact that they do want that is usually true. the number of supporters one requires to get reelected, to stay in office, depends on whether free and fair elections exist. That is certainly factually true. How one stays in office depends on the electoral system in place or the presence or absence of an electoral system in the first place. Right? So who you have to have support you to stay in office will depend on the system of government in place. That's just true. Politicians gain support by providing supporters with goods and services. This is also in general true factually. It's not quite as obviously true as the second bullet point, but it's also true in general that politicians give things or provide things or set up policies that help transfer things to their supporters, and those things help individuals acquire goods and services. And those goods and services make people happy with the politicians overall. These are generally true facts, but not true in all possible cases. And then a definition for the last assumption: public goods are goods that cannot be denied to anyone regardless of their support. This is the definition of a public good. A public good is a good that once you provide it, everyone can make use of, and you can't exclude anyone. So an implication from this potentially is, okay, politicians who want to stay in office, who face elections to stay in office, will provide more public goods than those who don't because they're trying to make people happy. Maybe a more specific implication might be the bigger the group of people you must actually get support from, the more likely you are to use public goods, because public goods help many people support you, whereas more private selective goods, club goods or individual goods, only help that person you give the goods to. So the more people you need to support you, the more likely you are to provide public goods that apply to everyone. This is part of what's called selective theory in political science. So that's one implication from a series of assumptions. The nice thing about laying it out this way is you can go through the assumptions. If you disagree with one of them, you could disagree with the implication. If you're doing this yourself, you would want to have more steps between the assumptions and the implication, because the implication here is not necessarily obvious from the assumptions. So you want to add in all the steps to make it extremely clear to anyone who reads it. All this is done before you look at data, before you take data, before you do any hypothesis testing. This is just about making sure your argument is clear and makes sense and provides internal consistency, and is internally valid. Right? That your assumptions are reasonable and your conclusions follow from your assumptions. That's checking the logic, and that's before you do anything else. The benefits of doing this, of stating our assumptions clearly, we discussed before a little bit, so I'll go through this quickly. But explicit statement of your assumptions makes you think precisely about your concepts, and that's the biggest benefit, right? These precise definitions help you understand exactly what you are saying, what you mean, and help you communicate to others what you mean in a way in which there'll be less confusion, right? When we don't have these clear assumptions laid out, and we don't have these clear logic laid out, we often, as human beings, rely upon identity to make arguments, right? Well, I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, or I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, and we disagree, and I'm going to work off of that identity in the U.S. case, right? Whereas if we focus on policy differences and on assumptions underlying policy differences, we might be able to make progress might be able to communicate better and make progress on some kind of mutually agreed upon outcome, right? So laying out our assumptions helps us think precisely for ourselves, and also helps us communicate with others in a way that's productive. We can also, from a more research perspective, benefit from laying out assumptions clearly because they help us identify other lines of research, right? If we're working through and looking to literature for this well-known theory and we get to their assumptions and decide, wow, those are just bad assumptions, well, that's an opportunity for improved research. We can see what happens with a different assumption in their place, and we can see how their conclusions hold or not hold when you change their assumptions, right? What are the implications when we use more accurate assumptions? Does most of the theory still hold up with slight changes in the margins, or does the theory fall apart completely? Right? This is an avenue for new research. Okay, so I'll conclude the section with a single example. This example of what's called the democratic peace, which is the empirical regularity that democracies tend to fight less often. This is a particular theory of that. This is not the only theory of that. This is just one possible theory. In this theory, we start the assumption that war happens due to bargaining failures. So the idea is two or more countries might be arguing over some piece of land or some water rights or some policy or whatever, and they're bargaining over some negotiated outcome, but they fail to come to an agreement, and that leads to war. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is that these failures are caused by uncertainty about the resolve of the other country. Here, resolve is the willingness of a country to escalate to war if the demands are too high. So the idea here is, I don't know, if I knew how resolved you were, I know exactly how far I can push you, and I would ask for as much as I could get from you. And you know how far you could push me and ask for as much as you could get, and that would produce a bargain, which we both asked for as much as we could get, and then we'd be happy there'd be no war. In contrast, if I'm not sure how much I can push you, I might push you too far, and then that would produce war, and that uncertainty in your resolve leads to war. So that's the first set of steps. This comes from a bunch of theories and models of war initiation. So now the democratic part makes the assumption that democratic leaders are more accountable than non-democratic leaders to the population. That is generally true. Democracies, by definition, are government forms in which the people have some ability to have a say over who is in office. Right? So assuming leaders want to stay in office, as we discussed before, then the people's ability to turn them out of office makes the democratic leaders, in theory, more accountable to the population. Accountability here increases what we call audience costs. The audience cost is the cost that the audience, the population, the electorate in this case, can put upon the politician and make that politician suffer, can impose upon on the politician. So this accountability of democracies to the electorate means the electorate can impose audience costs on the politician, and as these costs increase, the politician becomes less likely to do things that would impose these costs on them. So for instance, in this case, the cost we're talking about, the action we're talking about, is a politician claiming strongly, I will go to war if you push me too far. Right? So the other state might be uncertain about how serious that politician is in that statement they make. But in this case, we're saying that if that politician heads up a democracy, then that politician believes that should they back down from that statement, the electorate will hold them accountable for backing down and punish them, right, at the ballot box by maybe turning them out of their position. And that possible cost they might suffer for backing down leads them to back down less often. That means the resolve is less uncertain. Because of that, the states have less incentive to sort of push. They know better where their line is. And so if the leader of a democracy comes up and says, this is my line, it's more believable, and the uncertainty gets reduced, and both states can offer more reasonable bargains, and a bargain is more likely to happen, leading to less war. And that's where this conclusion comes from, theoretically, that pairs of democracies are less likely to experience military conflict because of this informational theory. So this is the conclusion. Now, I should say this conclusion can be true regardless of the underlying theory behind it. And this informational theory is not the only theory out there to explain the democratic peace. There could be other ones too, right? One simple one is just, well, democracies have norms against fighting each other, so they don't fight each other, right? That's a much simpler argument. It has less of the micro foundations you might think that lead to all sorts of strategic interactions, but it is an argument that would possibly hold. A good theory is not tested only by its single conclusion. So the fact that pairs of democracies might be less likely to experience military conflict does provide support for this informational theory, but it also supplies support for any theory that leads to the same conclusion. Rather, we want to have a theory that produces multiple testable hypotheses. In this case, we could test aspects of audience costs. Right? How do they work? Do people actually experience them? Do they actually impose them upon leaders? Right? These are all things that we can test, and political scientists have tested different aspects of these audience cost theories. If those additional tests bear out, and there's been sort of mixed results in a bunch of cases, if they do bear out, then we have support not just for this conclusion, but also for the theory as a whole. If they don't bear out, we could try to test other theories and see if they are more likely to be the theory that actually underlies this regularity. So you see, all these parts of theory building exist before we take any kind of data, and creating theories that are falsifiable, that are causal, help us get from sort of an acknowledgement of a puzzle or a pattern in the world to a theory that helps explain it and can be tested empirically.